green firebreaks are strips of low flammability vegetation established at strategic locations across the landscape, designed to reduce fire spread. And they do this by either stopping or slowing the fire front, extinguishing embers, and blocking radiant heat. They're best used in conjunction with other firefighting measures. So they might be used as a strategic location where firefighters or firefighting resources might be put in, so that you can actually sort of add additional layers to the benefit. And then, of course, particularly if we use native species, or depending on which species we choose, we can actually provide other services in those green firebreaks. So that includes biodiversity and food. Now, China is the world leader in establishing green firebreaks. And essentially, by the end of this year, they're on track to have planted over 500,000 kilometres of green firebreaks. And you can see these are these green strips along the ridges throughout this pine plantation. And here's an example of one of those green firebreaks, this Shimmer superba green firebreak, having stopped a fire in one forestry compartment block and prevented it from going into the other blocks. Now, obviously, these are really, really important native species and incredibly important commercial species. And they're very, very useful nursery plants, particularly on dry hills and other dry sites. Now, of course, they're also highly flammable, okay? So if you've got a dense canopy of either Carnuka or Manuka and the fire gets into that canopy, it's going to burn very, very well. So what we would recommend is that you continue to plant them. We're not saying don't plant them, just don't plant them around your house. Plant them in the landscape, but the crucial thing is to know the fire hazards that they cause and work out ways of managing those. And you can do that by creating green firebreaks around your Manuka and Carnuka plantings. You might do it by weaving lower flammability plants in amongst them as well too. And this sort of gets to I guess, one of the main points that you want to think about when you're planting for restoration in New Zealand. So succession is just the change in species composition over time, usually since a disturbance. And the really interesting thing that we have here in New Zealand is that basically there's a hump-shaped curve in flammability in the time since the last fire, okay? And that flammability is at its highest in the early stages post-disturbance. So post-disturbance, you'd get native things coming in like bracken, and then Manuka, and then Carnuka. And that whole system is generally going to be quite flammable for potentially many decades, and depending on where you are in the landscape, maybe up to 80 years or more. And also, we've got a whole range of weed species that we've introduced to New Zealand from more fire-prone landscapes overseas. So things like gorse, hakea from Australia, pine species and eucalypts are also quite flammable. And when you get some of those weeds in the system, this can actually make this relative flammability increase in these early stages until you get canopy closure and until you get towards a more mature New Zealand forest.
How wide does the green firebreak, how wide should it be in theory?
Yeah, great question. So there's actually a lot of debate about this and not a huge amount of testing. Some of the green firebreaks that have actually stopped quite substantial fires in China have been as narrow as 10 metres wide. It's pretty much going to be a case of the wider it can be, the better it's going to be. There's some rules of thumb that you want it to be, the green fire rate to be wider than I think it's 1.5 times the height of the flames. And so you can sort of base that on the vegetation that you're up against. It also is going to heavily depend on the context. If you're at the top of a ridge, or if you're got a more flammable vegetation type burning into that green firebreak, it's potentially going to have to be wider than that. And the other key thing to think about there too is the nature of how the fire might spread beyond that area. So the potential for the vegetation to actually have firebrands, embers blowing ahead of the fire front. And some of those, particularly with eucalypts, can blow up to many kilometres, even tens of kilometres. and pines can also be quite bad, sort of kilometre spread of embers. So there you're getting away from green firebreaks as being the only solution, and you want to be looking at all those multiple solutions. Quite often, these green firebreaks might be popped next to a road, and that enhances their function as a fire mitigation tool, because you've also got the road width, which can actually allow you to, or provides an area where there's less fuel, and it actually allows firefighters and firefighting resources to get in there and then use that green firebreak as a strategic point to fight that fire. So I would imagine that, well, obviously not up some of those steep slopes, and that's probably why they use them on some of those steep slopes, is they're using them as a bit of a plant and forget type model. So it sort of allows you to deal with things in more inaccessible terrain. But I would advocate that, again, as I mentioned previously, having a green firebreak in conjunction with other things. So having a road near, or just a dirt track that's accessible to fire trucks would be quite useful, because then the fire trucks can get in there, use that feature to their advantage. There's a number of different ways that you can use green firebreaks depending on what your broader goals are in the land.
What happens if you've got an existing forest fragment? It might be Kānuka or it might be something else. What can you do to protect that and surrounding land?
You could actually ring fence some of those with green fire, like native species of low flammability, and that would help enhance, it actually increases a buffer around your fragment of additional habitat, but can also help protect it against fire. Or alternatively, you could interplant it with lower flammability species and speed up that successional process, because that's the key thing, as I mentioned, is often the plan is to get to back to native bush in a lot of these areas. And, by planting a lot of those later successional species, you're generally planting lower flammability species.
What's the comparison between fire breaks of bare dirt or mown grass and green fire breaks?
Obviously, not having any fuel there makes it less likely. Well, if you have no fuel, it can't catch a light. But one of the things that green fire breaks do quite well is they also have a blocking role. So they can block radiant heat and they can block embers. And so it was interesting when I went to a workshop on this in Australia. There, even quite flammable plants like eucalypts can actually be quite important in the vicinity of a house for their ability to trap embers, to block embers. And if they're trimmed up and so the fire can't get from the ground up into their canopy, having those trees there to block embers is actually possibly an even more vital function than having just nothing there, but particularly if you've got an ember storm raining down on your house. And in Australia and New Zealand, the main way that houses are lost through fire is via embers blowing onto the house and then igniting something on or near the house and getting in that way. It generally tends to be less likely to be radiant heat or direct fire contact. So that maintenance is key, because some of these low flammable plants will produce dead material, and you need to remove that if you're wanting them to function well as a green fire break. Yeah. Now, where can you all find information on this? This is the National Plant Flammability Directory that we worked with FENS to put together. This is all found on the FENS website and the Check It's All Right website. Basically, it gives you the common name, the species, the flammability category, the type of plant that it is, so the growth form, what its use is, if that's relevant, and whether it's exotic or native. And you can actually then go through and search all 402 species that are in that database, based primarily on the work that we've done to get a sense of how flammable they are.